Bonjour, dans cette vidéo, on parle des adjectifs qualificatifs. So in this video, we're going to be talking about qualifying adjectives. So the first thing that we're going to notice is that adjectives position goes after our noun. So let's look at some examples. We have c'est une professeure intéressante. So we have une professeure, there's our professor, our teacher, right, who is intéressante. In English, we would say an interesting professor, but in French, we say a professor interesting. So it goes after. Un autre exemple. Le prof pose des questions faciles. Donc, des questions, questions, faciles, easy. So, easy questions in English, but des questions faciles, it will go after. So, the first rule that we want to learn is that adjectives are going to follow the noun. They're going to go after. The second thing we want to look at is their agreement. And when I'm talking about agreement, I mean their gender, which is masculine or feminine, and I'm talking about the number, if it's singular or plural. So if we look at our first example, un étudiant intelligent. Donc, un étudiant, we have a student. That's obviously masculine. How do I know that? Because I'm using un. And in addition to that, right, here's my un. And I'm using étudiant. And I have nothing at the end of étudiant, so I'm just going to say intelligent. Right? Un étudiant intelligent. Now that contrasts with une étudiant. And then here I want to add intelligente. Right? Because that is feminine, I want to have this E added on to my intelligente. Let's see if I can accomplish that. So you have un étudiant intelligent, une étudiante intelligente, and I am going to hear that T because that E will make the T pronounced. So, un étudiant intelligent, une étudiante intelligente. So that's the difference between masculine and feminine. Okay, let's look at our agreement in number. So you have des étudiants. So here I know I have more than one student. Des étudiants. And I have my S. That's telling me it's plural. And then I have intelligent, which also has an S. So everything agrees. Des étudiants intelligent with an S. Now, what if my group of students are all female? Then we're going to see this. Des étudiantes with an ES. E because they're feminine. S because there's more than one. And guess what? On my adjective, I'm going to say intelligente. Again, I'm going to pronounce that T, and I'm going to add the E because it's feminine, and then S because it's plural. So we want to agree in gender and in number. Gender meaning if the person I'm speaking about is masculine or feminine, and whether my group is plural or singular. So the general rule here is if it's feminine, I'm going to add an E. And if it's plural, I'm going to add an S. Now, I did note some exceptions here. If a word already ends in S or in an X, because that's also plural in French, the X, you will not add another S or an S after the X. Another thing to note in French is if I say Sylvie et Agnès sont françaises, right? So I have two girls here, two ladies, Sylvie et Agnès sont françaises. So I have français would be my masculine, but because they're feminine, I'm going to add an E. And because there's two of them, I'm going to add an S. Sont françaises. But if I say Sylvie, right, still feminine, et Adam sont français. Once I introduce a male, I'm just going to keep the masculine form, sont français. And again, as we mentioned up here, in the plural we would add an S unless it already ends in an S. And français obviously ends in an S, so I'm not going to have two S's at the end. So Sylvie et Adam sont français, but Sylvie et Agnès sont françaises. So that's an important thing to note. So you'll want to look at more things in your ebook here on page 67. Let's see if I can switch over. And I'm looking at the ebook here. You want to read about Haiti, right? Our cultural information about Haiti. We have avoir, right? And how you conjugate that with each one of our subjects. All of our expressions, they give you these great pictures, and you can hear them say the expressions, so you'll want to use those. And then we get closer to where we need pronunciation. You'll want to go through those. And then this is what I was talking about before, right? Un étudiant intelligent, des étudiants intelligents. They've got some more details there that you'll want to look at. And then we come to this box, right? Descriptive adjectives with irregular forms. So this is on page 67, and you'll want to look at this and study this, right? The couple examples I give you, we're just adding an E or we're just adding S's, but that is not always the case for every adjective in French. So we have adjectives in French that end with EUX or EUR in the masculine form, and in the feminine form they're going to have EUSE, euse. So we have heureux, right, which is the masculine, but if we look at the feminine we have heureuse. Then if you continue on, they show the plural, right? The plural and the singular, heureux, are exactly the same. But if we look at the plural and the feminine, we have heureuse with an added S. So you want to look at this chart and really get these words in your mind. Then we have travailleur, which has that E-U-R at the end. So in the feminine, we're going to say travailleuse, right? Elle est travailleuse. C'est une jeune femme travailleuse. And we're going to change the ending so they all agree. With the masculine on this one, you are going to add an S, right? Because it ends in an R, travailleur, but you're not hearing the S. And then with the feminine, you're still going to have travailleuse, but you are going to add the S to that. Then we come to words that end in ER in the masculine, like cher. And in the feminine, we see an accent appear, and I have an ER with an E. So the masculine is cher, and the feminine is also cher, but it's spelled differently. So you'll want to note that accent there. Then if it's plural in the masculine, there we just add an S. And the feminine, once we make it feminine, we just have to add an S. Then we have words, adjectives that end in IF. And the feminine is going to have an IVE. So sportif, right? Jean est sportif. Mais Marie est sportive, right? It changes to that IVE. Now the masculine, if it's more than one, if there's a group of people, right, we're just adding the S. And the feminine plural, once we make it feminine, sportive, we can just add an S. Then we have gentil, right, an IL in the masculine form. And in the feminine form, we're going to see that L double. So it's ILLE. So we have gentil and gentil. And the masculine form in the plural will add an S. And the feminine plural will also just add an S. But we first have to make it feminine. Then we have EL words that we keep the EL, but we double the L and add another E. So you have intellectuel, intellectuel. We don't really hear a difference between them, but they are spelled differently. And both of those in the plural are just adding S's. And then this last one we saw a lot when we were talking about the nationalities. Okay, so IEN in the masculine And the feminine, we see an I-E, double N-E. So parisien, parisienne, right? And then masculine plural, parisien, we're just adding the S. And once we've made it parisienne, feminine, we can just, again, add an S. And then, of course, they give you lots of notes, good notes, down here at the bottom, excuse me, where you can see other words that are similar. Courageux, courageuse, paresseux, paresseuse, sérieux, sérieuse, right? Fier, fier, naïf, naïve, Canadien, Canadienne, Tunisien, Tunisienne. There's a lot of nationalities that have that. Then there are a few words that are completely different. You want to notice that, right? So we have the form of beau, which is handsome, or it can be used as beautiful. And then they're going to tell us over here that the feminine is belle. And then for the word new, we have nouveau, and the feminine form is nouvelle. And then we have the word chic, and that's invariable. It means it doesn't change. Another thing that you'll want to go through when you look at adjectives in agreement is you want to look at your colors, because there's some important notes about them. So if we talk about un chemisier, right, the blouse, it can be blanc, bleu, gris, noir, vert, violet. When we study the colors, we are studying them in their masculine form. But if we switch and we're talking about a feminine object, une chemise, our blanc becomes blanche. Our bleu is bleu, but with an E added. Our gris is grise, with an E added. We have our noir, we add that E again, noir. We have vert, becomes verte, with an E. And then violet, we have violette, the T doubles, and we add an E. Then they note that there is the word or the color jaune. And we're going to use that whether it's masculine or feminine. Un pantalon jaune, une robe jaune. And then we have two that don't want to follow the rules, marron et orange. Right, they're invariable, meaning they don't change. Une robe, we're not going to add an E to marron. And of course, orange already has an E. Okay, and then if we have it in the plural, des robes, marron, orange, we don't even see an S. So those are a couple of exceptions, and you'll really want to note those and study those, so when it comes to the test, you won't miss those. I hope that helps looking at some of these examples. Let me know if you have any questions. Au revoir.